Hey, how you guys doing? It's been a while. Well, it's just been last week Friday, but I just want to know if you guys actually had a good weekend, and maybe I can't really know it, but I'm just hoping you did have a good weekend. I know there's no social gatherings because of what is going on, and you guys can't go on your parties and everything. But hopefully, you guys are really productive during the weekend, and hopefully you feel rested. I know it's difficult times right now, but just stay positive. I like to encourage you to just make the best of the moment right now. We all going through this, and we all going to, we're all going to sail through this together, right? So last week I basically just gave you an introduction of what economics is all about. We just looked at chapter one. But this time we actually going to delve into chapter three, which is basically demand and supply, right? So demand and supply is one of the most important concepts you ever learn in economics. Every branch of economics basically depends on demand and supply. So if you're looking at international economics, you're looking at financial economics, you're looking at monetary economics, you're looking at development economics, macroeconomics, microeconomics, you need to understand demand and supply. Once you understand demand and supply, basically you have economics down, right? So today I'm going to be talking about the demand side of the market, okay? And first of all, I'll actually say what a market is. A market, remember we live in a capitalist society, so everything is basically for sale, right? Your textbooks, you have to buy them. Your sneakers, you have to buy them. Your phones, you have to buy them. The laptops, you have to buy them. Almost everything is actually for sale in a capitalist society, and that's just the way the market works, right? So in understanding demand and supply, we actually need to understand what a market is, or we actually need to know what a market is under economic conditions, right? So the learning objectives for this chapter, and I always start with learning objectives because I feel like knowing what the learning objectives are and understanding what the learning objectives are actually going to help you master the chapter, right? So I want you guys to be really, really good at this, okay? The first thing we're going to take a look at is basically describe what a competitive market is, right? So what is a competitive market, right? But before we actually even get into a competitive market, you actually need to know the definition of a market in economics. What really is a market, okay? Then we'll look at what demand is. So what is demand? What does demand actually mean, right? And we'll look at the factors that actually affect demand. So this is our second objective. Understand what demand means and know the influences or the factors that actually affect demand. The third thing we'll look at is supply. Okay, so understand what supply is and know the factors or influences basically that affect supply. The fourth thing we'll look at is basically understand and explain how demand and supply basically influence prices and quantities bought and sold in a market. Okay, so in a market, prices are basically what drives the market. So in a market system, in a capitalist society, prices are basically what drives it. So we need to understand how demand and supply come together to actually influence prices and quantities bought and sold in a market, okay? And the last thing you need to do is to know how to use the demand and supply model, and we'll look at this later, to make predictions about prices. So just using demand and supply, you can actually predict prices. You can actually predict what is going to be bought and sold in a market. Okay, so these are the 5 fundamental things you need to know. Once you master these things, I'm pretty sure you're actually going to be really comfortable with the chapter. Okay, right, so the first thing we need to delve into is a market. Like I said, in America or in any advanced country or economy, is a capitalist society, and almost everything is for sale, right? You thinking of a market, you probably think of Walmart, you probably think of Target, Fairway, Hy-Vee, right? But actually in economics, a market is way simple than that, right? A market is basically defined as a place or a condition or a system where buyers and sellers of a good interact with each other. That is it, really, right? So in a market, you could just have one buyer and one seller, and once they interact with each other, is basically considered as a market in economics, okay? Right, so you could have an infinite number of buyers, you could have an infinite number of sellers. Once they interact with each other, is basically a market, right? So a market does not necessarily have to be a physical location, right? For example, you have Walmart, or you have maybe a specific mall or anything. It could just be me selling something to you, and that's essentially a market, right? In demand and supply analysis, which is really crucial for microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? We actually going to be looking at a competitive market. Okay, so a competitive market is a market which has an infinite amount of sellers and an infinite amount of buyers, meaning it has so many buyers and so many sellers to the point where one seller or one buyer cannot actually influence the price of the good, okay? So a good example that actually comes into my mind is look at the state of Iowa, right? We have so many corn farmers in the state of Iowa, and we have so many people actually buy corn. Me not buying corn today will not influence the price of corn anywhere in Iowa. Like, nobody really cares because you have so many buyers in the market anyway. Me choosing not to buy corn is not going to make a difference. Likewise, if a corn farmer decides not to sell their corn, if just one corn farmer decides not to sell their corn, or his corn, or her corn, right? It's not going to influence the price of corn, basically, right? It's still going to be the same. So a competitive market, you have so many buyers and sellers that, right, what one person does doesn't really matter for the price. It doesn't really matter for the quantities bought or sold. Okay, so that is the definition of a competitive market, right? So we know what a market basically is. Remember, it's an interaction between buyers and sellers, okay? It could be one buyer and many sellers. That's a monopsony. We'll go into that later when we're looking at micro. It could be one seller and many buyers. That's basically a monopoly, right? Or it could be an infinite number of sellers and buyers, and basically that's a competitive market, okay? But in a market, right, what actually drives a market is basically the prices, okay? So buyers and sellers actually haggle over prices, right? They determine what the prices should be in a competitive market. But then again, what really is a price, okay? So a price, or the money price, is defined as the amount of money needed to buy a certain good, right? So for example, if I walk into Walmart and the price of an apple is $2, right? I need $2 to just buy one apple. Well, that is the money price of an apple. If I walk into Foot Locker, right, and I want to buy the newest Nikes and it costs maybe $80, right, that is the money price of the Nikes, right? If I walk into Apple Store and I want to buy an iPhone and it costs $900, well, that is the money price of an iPhone, right? So basically, the money price is the amount of money which is used to buy the good, okay? And we need to differentiate between what we call the money price and also the relative price, okay? So for example, if I told you that a pound of beef cost only 50 cents, you say to me, Dr. Kweku or Nana, hey, that's a really good deal, right? But what if I told you a pound of chicken actually costs 10 cents? Then you say, maybe a pound of beef costing 50 cents, maybe it's not a really good deal after all. Why? Because we're actually looking at the relative price, okay? So the relative price is comparing the price of one good to the price of another similar good, okay? And that is how you come across the relative price, okay? And in that sense, right, since you actually compare it to another good, basically it's the opportunity cost. The relative price of one good is also the opportunity cost, okay? So for example, with 50 cents for a pound of beef, right, the opportunity cost of that is basically 10 cents for a pound of chicken, right? That is what you basically give up to get 50 cents for a pound of beef. Right? So that is the money price, the relative price. We know what a competitive market is, and we know what a market itself is, okay? So we say that market basically consists of buyers and sellers, right? So now we're going to look at the buyer side of the market, and the buyer side of the market is always demand, okay? So I'm just going to write it here so you always remember the buyer's side of the market. So this is the buyers. Right? This is essentially the consumers, right? Now, if you demand something, or in economics, for something to be constituted as demand, right, it has to meet 3 criteria, okay? So first of all, you need to want that good. Second, you need to be able to afford it. And 3, you need to have a definite plan to buy it, right? That actually constitutes demand in economics, right? So my dream car is actually a Corvette Stingray, right? Do I want it? Yes, I do. Can I afford it? Unfortunately, Wartburg doesn't pay me now, so I can't afford a Corvette Stingray. So no, I can't afford it. Do I have a definite plan to buy it? Well, not now or not anytime soon because of my Saki pay from Wartburg, right? So in that sense, I'm not part of the demand market for a Corvette, right? What about red wine? I love red wine. Do I want red wine? Yes. Can I afford it? Pretty much it's only $20 if you go to Walmart. Do I have a definite plan to buy it? Pretty much, yes. I have a definite plan to buy red wine at some point and drink and relax and chill and watch Netflix, right? So, in that sense, I am part of the demand market for red wine, okay? So from these criteria, we can actually define what quantity demanded is, okay? So quantity demanded, right, of a good is basically the amount that consumers plan to buy so long as their demand is satisfied, okay, at a particular time and at a particular price, okay? So for example, I walk into Walmart and I want to buy 2, let's say, wine bottles for a price of $20. At a price of $20, quantity demanded of red wine is basically 2. Or I go to Walmart and I want to buy an apple, 2 apples for, let's say, the price of $4. The quantity demanded of an apple at a price of $4 is basically 2 apples, okay? So quantity demanded of a good or a service is the amount that consumers plan to buy during a particular period and a particular price. But remember, again, they must want the good, they must be able to afford it, and they should have a definite plan to actually buy it, okay? Now, buyers in the market, okay, so again, we're looking at the buyer side of the market. Buyers in the market actually behave a certain way, and we actually need to analyze the way they behave, okay? So in a way, this is consumer behavior, right? So it actually brings into question what we call the law of demand. And the law of demand states that the higher the price of a good, the lesser the quantity demanded, okay? So again, you're looking at the relationship between the price of some good or commodity, right, and the quantity demanded of that good, okay? So the higher the price, the smaller the quantity demanded. Essentially, there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, which actually makes sense, right? The more something is expensive, the less you buy of it, okay? And conversely, the lower the price of a good, the larger the quantity demanded of that good. Okay, the lower the price of a good, the larger the quantity demanded of a good. So long as a good is cheap and it gets cheaper, you actually decide to buy more of that good, okay? So why is it that the law of demand is that way? Why is that there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded? Well, there are 2 reasons, okay? And you need to know these reasons. They're really, really important, okay? We have what we call the substitution effect, and we have what we call the income effect. And I'm going to explain these 2 effects in a minute, okay? These 2 effects basically determine why the law of demand stands that there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, where when something is really expensive, you buy less of it, and when something is really cheap, you actually buy more of it, okay? So the substitution effect says that when something becomes relatively expensive, right, you actually switch from that good and decide to buy something else, okay? So think of it this way. When the price of Coke actually, so let's say Coke and Pepsi are relatively the same. When the price of Pepsi increases, right, and let's say you're indifferent between Pepsi and Coke, you can barely taste the difference. I can barely taste the difference. When the price of Pepsi increases, the quantity demanded of Pepsi falls. Why? Because people switch from buying Pepsi to actually buying Coke, because Coke is relatively cheaper. Likewise, if the price of Pepsi decreases, people switch from buying Coke to buying Pepsi because Pepsi is relatively cheaper, okay? So that is the substitution effect, okay? If the price of beef becomes really expensive or goes up, people switch from buying beef to buying chicken because chicken is relatively cheaper. If the price of beef actually decreases, people switch from buying chicken to actually buying beef because beef is relatively cheaper, and that is the substitution effect, okay? And then we have the income effect, and the income effect looks at what we call your purchasing power or your affordability. If something becomes relatively expensive and you have the same budget, you actually buy less of it, okay? So let's say some sneakers cost $50, okay? And you have a budget of $100. Well, it's $50, so you can actually buy 2 of it. But what if the sneaker actually jumps up to $100 in price? Now you can only buy 1, so quantity demanded of that sneaker actually falls, right? So that is the income effect. Basically, it looks at affordability and your purchasing power. As long as something becomes very expensive, it's less affordable because your income, we are assuming, does not change, okay? And so long as it becomes cheaper, it's more affordable because then in a way you actually have more income and you can actually afford that good in that sense, okay? Right, so that is the substitution effect, and that is essentially the income effect. Right, and the substitution effect and the income effect, remember, actually explain the law of demand. The next thing we'll look at is basically the demand curve and the demand schedule. So in economics, we love drawing a lot of graphs, okay? Basically, graphs help us understand everything. So there's going to be a curve that will help us understand basically what is going on in terms of demand, right? So first of all, we need to define demand. So demand itself looks at the entire relationship, and this is really important, okay? The demand curve, or the demands itself, right? It looks at the entire relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of the good. Bear in mind the law of demand, right? So it looks at the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of a good. We already know this relationship is negative, where when the price of the good increases, the quantity demanded of the good actually decreases. And if the price of the good decreases, the quantity demanded of the good actually increases, okay? And the demand curve is basically a graphical representation of the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded of a good when all other factors that might affect demand is held the same, okay? So we're solely looking at just demand, we're solely looking at just quantity demanded and the price of the good, okay? So that is demand, and that is the demand curve, right? From there, we can actually draw our demand curve, and in a way, we have an idea of how our demand curve is actually going to look like, okay? So let's look at a market for energy bars, okay? In this market for energy bars, remember, we're trying to find the demand, right, curve. So we're looking at only the relationship between price and quantity demanded, okay? So we have price, okay? So when price is 50 cents, quantity demanded of the energy bars is 22. So we have 50 cents here, and quantity demanded is 22. Okay, so we have quantity always on our x-axis or the horizontal line, okay, and we have price always on our y-axis, okay, so this is price, okay, sorry about that, okay. When price increases to $1, quantity demanded actually decreases to 15, and again, this is due to the law of demand, right? Energy bars have become expensive, so people are actually buying less, okay, so we get to point B, okay. When price increases to $1.50, right, quantity demanded decreases to $10, okay? If price keeps on going up to, let's say, $2, quantity demanded will decrease to 7, okay? And basically, we are point D. And if price increases to $2.50, quantity demanded will decrease to 5, and essentially, we are point E, okay? Right, so again, as you can see, as price increases, quantity demanded also falls, okay? As price increases, quantity demanded also falls. And again, this is due to the law of demand and the substitution and income effect, like we said earlier, okay? So now we can connect all these dots, and that is how our demand curve is essentially going to look like. Our demand curve is going to be what we call negatively sloped. So it's negatively sloped. Or it's downward sloping. Right? It's downward sloping or it's negatively sloped. Why? Because as price increases, quantity demanded decreases, and as price decreases, quantity demanded increases, okay? And this is due to the law of demand, okay? So the law of demand, LOD, okay? right? So that actually determines our demand curve, right? From there, we can also say that as a rise in price, right, there's a decrease in quantity demanded and there's a movement up along the demand curve. So this is really important, okay? So as price increases from $1.50 to $2, right, we move from 10 to 7, okay? Quantity demanded decreases from 10 to 7, and we move from point C to D, and it's a movement up along the demand curve, okay? And conversely, right, when there's a fall in price, there's an increase in quantity demanded, and there's a movement down along the demand curve, okay? Right, so if price decreases from $1.50 to $1, people actually buy more because it's relatively cheaper, okay? And quantity demanded increases, okay? So we move from point C to B, and that is a change in quantity demanded, okay? That is not a change in demand, but it's a change in quantity demanded, okay? So a change in quantity demanded, listen carefully, has to do with a change in price of the good itself, okay? Now we'll look at a change in demand. And what is a change in demand? A change in demand has to do with any factor other than the price of the good, right, influencing buying plans, okay? Any factor other than the price of the good influencing buying plans, okay? So for example, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, okay, the demand for hand sanitizers actually went up. It wasn't because the price of hand sanitizers went down. No, it was because there was a pandemic, right? So people had to be extra careful and extra safe. So the demand for hand sanitizers actually went up, okay? Some external factor other than the price affecting demand is what we call a change in demand. And notice carefully, we're saying a change in demand and not a change in quantity demanded. A change in quantity demanded has to do with a change in the price of the good itself, okay? Right. And one thing you need to know is that when demand increases, the demand curve will shift to the right, okay? The whole demand curve will shift to the right, and this is something you need to remember, okay? And when demand decreases, the entire demand curve will actually shift to the left, okay? Because at the same price, less is demanded, right? So the demand curve will shift to the left, okay? So how does it look like, right? We said a movement along the demand curve is basically a change in quantity demanded, right? But an external factor other than the price will actually cause demand to increase, and that is a shift of the demand curve from D0 to D1, okay? And a decrease in demand has to do with the demand curve shifting to the left, okay? So that is the shift of the demand curve, right? The next thing we'll look at is basically factors that can actually shift the demand curve, okay? So what are the factors that actually influence demand, okay? Well, the first one is what we call the prices of related goods, and we actually delve into this more deeper later on. The second one is expected future prices. The third one is income. The fourth one is expected future income and credit. The fifth one is population. And the last one is preferences, okay? Right. So the first one we'll look at is the prices of related goods, okay? So how does the prices of related goods change the demand for a certain good, okay? So first of all, sorry about that. So first of all, we need to define a certain type of good, which is a substitute good. And a substitute good is any good that can be used in place of another good because they basically perform the same function. Okay, so that is a substitute good. Any good that can be used in place of another good. Why? Because they basically perform the same function, right? So an example is Pepsi and Coke, or beef and chicken. Those are substitute goods. Okay, and we have a complement, right? A complement good is a good that is used in conjunction with another good, right? So for example, we have tennis rackets and tennis balls. You can't play tennis. Well, you basically can't play tennis racket. I mean, you can't play tennis without having a tennis racket and a tennis ball, right? And a tennis racket is basically useless without a tennis ball. And to some extent, a tennis ball is basically useless without a tennis racket as well, unless you want to play some form of beer pong. But anyway, you guys don't drink, so right? And we have peanut butter and jelly, okay? So those goods are complements because they use together, right? And what you need to think about in terms of substitutes and complement goods is that for substitutes, if the price of Coke, for example, increases, the demand of a substitute increases as well, okay? So if the price of a good increases, the demand of a substitute increases as well, right? So if the price of Coke increases, Coke becomes relatively expensive, so the demand of Pepsi increases. Even though the price of Pepsi hasn't changed or anything, because Coke is relatively expensive, the demand for Pepsi actually increases, okay? And conversely, if the price of Coke decreases, the demand of a substitute falls as well, okay? So for substitutes, basically, they move in the same direction, right? Increases, the substitute increases. If the good decreases, the price of the good decreases, the demand of a substitute decreases as well, okay? If the price of Coke decreases, Coke becomes relatively cheaper, right, compared to Pepsi, and more people buy Coke, okay? And then we have the complement. If the price of peanut butter, for example, increases, okay, if the price of a complement increases, the demand for its if the price of a good increases, the demand for its complement falls, okay? So if the price of peanut butter increases, people buy less peanut butter, and hence they actually buy less jelly because peanut butter goes with jelly, okay? And likewise, if the price of peanut butter falls, the demand for jelly increases. If the price of peanut butter falls, well, people buy more peanut butter, and since peanut butter actually goes well with jelly, people actually demand more jelly as well, okay? So that is the prices of related goods, okay? And then we have expected future prices, okay? If the price of a good is expected to increase in the future, current demand for the good increases, right? And the demand curve will shift rightward, which actually makes sense. If you think the price of a good is going to go high in the future, why wait in the future when the price of the good is really expensive? You're actually going to buy the good now. Likewise, if the price of a good decreases, is expected to decrease in the future, there's supposed to be a massive sale in the future, right? The current demand for the good will actually decrease because people will actually anticipate the sale and will demand more of the good in the future, okay? And then we have income, right? For income, generally when income increases, people buy more of the good, okay? Right? But it depends on the type of the good. If it's a normal good, okay? So a normal good is a good where demand increases as your income increases. Example is clothing, okay? Example is clothing. The more income you have, the more clothes you decide to buy. Another example is appliances or gadgets or electronics. The more money you have, the more electronics you decide to buy, okay? So in that sense, the demand increases as income increases. Likewise, the demand decreases as income decreases, okay? And then we have an inferior good, okay? So an inferior good is a good for which the demand increases when the demand decreases when income actually increases, okay? So you buy less of the good as your income increases, okay? You buy less of the good as your income actually increases. An example is ramen noodles. As you become rich or as you get richer, there's no need to buy ramen noodles, right? You actually want to buy calamari, you want to buy steak, you want to buy something good, right? So as your income increases, demand for that good decreases. At the same time, as your income decreases, man, you need to save, so you're gonna buy some ramen noodles now, okay? So demand actually increases in that sense for inferior goods, okay? And then we have expected future income and credit, okay? When you think your income is expected to increase in the future, your demand for something will increase now because you know you're going to get paid higher in the future, okay? And then you have population. When there's a larger population in the market, the demand for that good actually increases. If there's a lesser population, the demand for that good falls. Okay. We also have preferences, right? So if something becomes trendy, more people tend to buy it. Okay. So for example, if something becomes trendy, more people tend to buy it. And if something becomes less trendy, people tend not to buy. So demand decreases. Okay. So that essentially is demand. Okay. That essentially is demand. Right. So if you don't understand anything, please send me an email and ask me questions. Come to my office hours. I know I went through this just a little bit fast, but you guys have the luxury of actually pausing and actually trying to understand and make sense of things, okay? So in the meantime, I'm just going to leave you with a class activity, right? And think about this. What will happen to the demand for hot dogs if the following occur? The price of mustard increases. What will happen to the demand for hot dogs? The price of a hamburger actually rises, okay? And consumers' incomes actually increase, okay? These three things, think about it, okay? That's going to be your mini sort of activity, class activity, something to think and ponder about, okay? And just in case you want to know the answers, right? If the price of mustard increases, the demand for hot dogs is actually going to fall. Right? Because hot dogs and mustard tend to be complements, okay? If the price of mustard increases, people are buying less mustard and hence less hot dogs, okay? If the price of a hamburger rises, the demand for hot dogs will actually increase because they're actually substitutes, okay? And assuming that hot dog is a normal good, if consumers' incomes increase, right, the demand for hot dogs will increase as well, okay? So I'd like to stop here, and next time when we come back, we'll be looking at the seller side of the market, which is essentially supply, okay? Again, if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. You guys have been wonderful, and I'll see you soon. Take care.